A frightened single mother approached a Hell's Angel and whispered, "Marry me today." 12 hours after he understood why, he did something shocking. Her name was Elena Vance, and she had been running on fear and caffeine for weeks. She worked double shifts as a nurse at the local clinic just to keep the lights on in a small, weathered house she shared with her 6-year-old daughter, Sophie. The child's father, Mark, had passed away in a tragic accident a year ago, leaving behind a hole in their lives that no amount of work could fill. Elena was a woman of peace, a woman who had spent her life healing others, which made the fact that she was now standing in a den of outlaws all the more desperate. Before we reveal the terrifying reason Elena was forced to ask for a wedding ring from a stranger, and the incredible way the Hells Angels responded to her plea, I have to ask, who is standing with us today? Drop a comment below and tell us which city or country you are watching from. We love seeing how far our global brotherhood of viewers reaches. And if you believe that a mother's love is the strongest force on earth, hit that subscribe button right now to join our family of protectors. Jax, the chapter president of the local Hells Angels, stood up slowly from the heavy oak bar. He was a mountain of a man, his skin a roadmap of tattoos and scars earned on the long, unforgiving stretches of the American highway. He had seen Elena before. She was the quiet, compassionate nurse who had once stitched up a brother's road rash in the middle of the night without asking for an ID or calling the police. She was a friend of the club, but seeing her here, in the dim, amber light of the clubhouse at 9 p.m., told Jax that the real world had finally broken her. The clubhouse was thick with the smell of stale tobacco, expensive bourbon, and the metallic tang of motorcycle grease. Usually, this was a place of rowdy laughter and loud music, but as Elena stood there, the room went deathly silent. Her hair was disheveled, her scrubs were wrinkled, and her hands were shaking so violently that she had to grip her daughter's shoulder just to stay upright. Little Sophie was clutching a tattered ribbon, her eyes wide and glassy, reflecting the flickering neon beer signs that lined the walls. "Elena," Jack said, his voice a low, cautious rumble that silenced the rest of the room. "That's a hell of a thing to ask a man you barely know. We're outlaws, Elena. We aren't exactly the happily ever after type. You want to tell me why you're looking for a preacher at midnight? This isn't a chapel, and I'm not a saint." Elena didn't blink. She stepped forward, her voice a mere thread of sound that barely carried over the hum of the refrigerator. "I don't need a marriage, Jax. I don't need a house with a white picket fence or a man to hold my hand. I need a fortress. I need a legal name that makes people stop looking at me like I'm prey. I need a husband who the state is too afraid to question, and a name that carries enough weight to crush anyone who tries to take what's mine." Jax gestured to a quiet booth in the back, away from the prying eyes of the street. Big Mike and T-Bone moved instinctively to the front door, flipping the closed sign and locking the heavy iron bolt. They knew Elena wasn't looking for a fairy tale. She was looking for a shield. They had seen many people come to the clubhouse over the years, but no one had ever come with a request like this. "Sit," Jax commanded. He signaled the bartender for a glass of water and a small plate of fruit for the girl. "Now talk. Start from the beginning. Who is trying to take your life apart? Because I don't sign my name to anything unless I know exactly what kind of war I'm joining." Elena took a shaky breath, her eyes darting to the window every time a car passed by outside. The rain had started to fall, a drizzle that turned the pavement outside into a dark, shimmering mirror. "It's my late husband's family, Jax. The Sterling family. They own the banks, the real estate, and most of the politicians in this county. When Mark died, I thought they'd leave us alone. But Mark left behind a trust fund, a massive one, that only Sophie can inherit when she turns 18. If I'm her guardian, I control the estate. But the Sterlings, they don't want a common nurse holding the keys to their fortune. They want total control, and they'll destroy me to get it." She paused, her breath hitching in a way that made Jax's jaw tighten. They filed a protection of interest claim. They've hired private investigators to follow me, to film me at my tiredest, to make it look like I'm neglectful. They've staged photos. They've followed me to the grocery store. And they even bribed a social worker to document unstable living conditions in my home. The emergency custody hearing is tomorrow at 9 a.m. My lawyer told me that as a single mother with no local family and a questionable income compared to their millions, the judge will likely grant them temporary custody. If Sophie goes to them tonight, I'll never see her again. They'll ship her to a boarding school in Europe and bury me in legal fees until I simply vanish from the records. Unfit, T-Bone growled from the bar, his voice dripping with venom. You're a nurse. You've saved half the people in this town. You're the most fit person I've ever met. They're powerful, T-Bone, Elena said, a tear finally escaping and tracking through the dust on her cheek. My lawyer said the only way to stop the emergency order is to prove that there is a stable, two-parent household with a father figure who can provide significant and immediate security. He said I needed a miracle. I told him I didn't need a miracle. I needed a Hell's Angel. I needed someone the Sterlings couldn't buy, couldn't bully, and couldn't threaten. Jax leaned back, his leather vest creaking under the strain of his massive shoulders. He looked at Sophie, who was quietly eating a slice of apple, oblivious to the fact that her future was being auctioned off by her own blood relatives. He thought about his own mother, about the struggles she had faced, and he felt a cold, familiar rage beginning to simmer in his chest. So you want to marry me? Jax said, a grim, humorless smile playing on his lips. You think a judge is going to see a man with a rap sheet, a wall of tattoos, and a loud motorcycle and think, yeah, that's a stable household for a 6-year-old girl? No, Elena said, leaning forward, her eyes burning with a desperate, fierce intelligence. The judge won't care about the bikes. The judge might even hate you. But the Sterlings? They're cowards, Jax. They hide behind gated communities, expensive lawyers, and hollow reputations. If I marry you tonight, I'm not just a nurse anymore. I'm an old lady. My house becomes clubhouse territory. Sophie becomes a legacy of the Hells Angels. The Sterlings won't touch me because they know you don't file lawsuits. You handle things. I'm not looking for a husband, Jax. I'm looking for a deterrent. I'm looking for the one thing their money can't buy, the absolute protection of the pack. The room went silent. It was a brilliant, dangerous gamble. It was the kind of move that would put the Hells Angels in the crosshairs of the wealthiest family in the state, but it was also the kind of move that the club was built for. They didn't care about polite society or the opinions of the elite. They cared about the people who dared to ask for help when the world turned its back on them. 12 hours, Jax whispered, looking at the heavy brass clock on the wall. It was exactly 9 p.m. The courthouse opens in 12 hours. That's not much time to plan a wedding, Elena. Jax stood up, his presence filling the room. He looked at Big Mike and T-Bone, who were already standing at attention. We've got a lot of work to do. Mike, call the chaplain. Tell him we need a ceremony at the clubhouse by midnight. I don't care if he's in bed. Tell him the president is calling. T-Bone, get the brothers on the horn. I want a 30-man escort to the courthouse tomorrow morning. If the Sterlings want to see a stable household, we're going to show them the most united family they've ever seen. And I want the clubhouse garage converted into a living suite for Elena and the girl by dawn. If that social worker comes back, I want her to find a fortress, not an apartment. Elena's head hit the table as she began to sob, not out of sadness, but out of the sheer, soul-crushing relief of finally having someone to stand in front of her. For months, she had been fighting this battle alone, drowning in legal papers and the fear of losing her child. Now, she had an army. Jax reached out a massive, tattooed hand and placed it gently on her shoulder, his touch surprisingly light for a man of his size. Dry your eyes, Elena, Jax said. You're a Hells Angel's wife now. That means you don't cry for mercy anymore. You let them cry. By sunrise, you won't be a victim. You'll be the queen of the road, and Sophie will be the safest kid in this county." Just as Jax finished his sentence, the sound of tires screeching echoed from the parking lot outside. Two black Mercedes-Benzes pulled up, blocking the clubhouse exit. A man in a tailored, $5,000 suit stepped out, holding a thick legal folder and a cell phone. He looked out of place in the industrial district, his polished shoes stepping carefully over the puddles. "That's him," Elena whispered, her face turning ghost white. "That's Richard Sterling's head of security. He's here to take her tonight." They must have pushed the emergency order through early. They aren't even waiting for the morning hearing. Jax didn't look worried. He looked hungry. He reached for his leather vest, zipped it up with a sharp metallic click, and turned to his brothers. "Open the door. Let's see how much his legal authority is worth when he's standing in the middle of a war zone. Mike, stay with the girl. T-Bone, you're with me." Richard, the man in the suit, walked toward the door with the practiced arrogance of someone who had never been told no in his entire life. He believed that a piece of paper and a wealthy employer made him untouchable. But as the door swung open, he didn't find a helpless nurse. He found a wall of leather, tattoos, and 84 years of combined outlaw history staring back at him. "I'm here for the girl," Richard said, his voice cold and clipped, trying to mask the slight tremor in his hands. "I have the signed emergency custody papers right here. Elena Vance violates the court's preliminary findings. Step aside." Jax stepped out onto the porch, his massive shadow swallowing the smaller man. The rain was coming down harder now, soaking into Jax's vest and making his tattoos glisten under the porch light. "You're about 3 hours too late, Richard. Elena isn't a Vance anymore. And that paper in your hand? It's officially outdated information." "What are you talking about?" Richard hissed, glancing nervously at the bikers beginning to emerge from the shadows of the parking lot, their silhouettes illuminated by the flickering street lamps. Jax leaned in close, his voice like grinding stones. "I'm talking about my wife. We're heading to the courthouse tomorrow to finalize the paperwork, but as of right now, you're standing on private property, bothering a Hells Angels family. And in this town, Richard, that's a very dangerous thing to do. My brothers don't take kindly to people trespassing on our home, and they take even less kindly to people threatening our children." Jax looked at the SUVs and then back at Richard. "Now, get back in your car and tell the Sterlings that if they want to see the bride, she'll be at the courthouse at 9 a.m. But tell them to bring more than lawyers. Because if they try to touch my daughter, they're going to need an army, and even that might not be enough." Richard looked at the bikers, the engines of 30 Harleys starting to roar in a synchronized chorus of defiance. The vibration was so intense it rattled the windows of his Mercedes. He realized, for the first time in his life, that his money and his titles couldn't buy him a way out of this. He retreated to his car, and the Hells Angels watched the taillights fade into the rainy night. 12 hours, Jax, T-Bone said, looking at the clock. "Then let's get to work," Jax replied, turning back to Elena. "We've got a wedding to host and a family to protect." The rain continued to hammer against the corrugated metal roof of the Hells Angels clubhouse as the clock struck midnight, marking the transition from a night of desperation to a day of destiny. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted from a tense, guarded standoff to something solemn and ancient. The air, usually thick with the scent of grease and tobacco, was now joined by the surprising fragrance of wild lilies, flowers the brothers had scavenged from a local florist delivery truck just minutes before they closed, wanting to ensure this wasn't just a legal transaction, but a ritual of the pack. Jax stood at the front of the room, under the flickering neon sign of the club's emblem, wearing a clean black shirt under his heavy leather vest. Opposite him stood Elena. She was still in her wrinkled nurse's scrubs, but the club had draped a heavy, hand-stitched leather jacket over her shoulders, the property of Jax patch already pinned to the back, marking her as untouchable. Before we reveal the final, shocking secret Jax discovered about the Sterling family in the dead of night, and the incredible way he used it to destroy their case in court. I have to ask, are you still riding with us? Drop a comment below with the word fortress if you believe a family is more than just blood. We love seeing our global brotherhood of truth seekers grow. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button to join our family. Now, let's go back to that midnight ceremony where an outlaw became a husband and a mother found her army. The chaplain, a weathered veteran with a gray beard reaching his chest and eyes that had seen 1,000 miles of unforgiving road, stood between them. He didn't read from a traditional religious book. He read from the unwritten code of the highway. He spoke of loyalty that transcends the law, of the long ride through life's darkest valleys, and of the absolute, unbreakable vow to protect the pack at all costs. As Jax reached out and took Elena's hand, his rough, calloused fingers steadying her trembling ones, he placed a heavy silver ring on her finger. It was engraved with the club's intricate scrollwork, a piece of jewelry that carried more weight in this town than any diamond ever could. The brothers stood in a circle around them, letting out a low, rhythmic thumping of their boots against the wooden floorboards, a biker's heartbeat. It wasn't a wedding for the society pages. It was a declaration of war against anyone who would try to hurt her. I, Jax, take you, Elena, as my old lady, he said, his voice a gravelly vow that seemed to vibrate the very air in the room. Your fight is my fight. Your daughter is my daughter. Your debts are paid, and your shadow is my shadow. Where you go, the club follows. Anyone who looks at you must now look at me. As the ceremony ended, there was no long reception or toast. They only had 9 hours until the courthouse doors opened, and Jax knew that a marriage certificate was only a temporary shield. It might stop the emergency order for a day, but the Sterlings had enough money to litigate Elena into the grave. To win, he needed to do more than just marry her. He needed to cut the head off the snake and expose the rod at the center of the Sterling Empire. While Elena and Sophie were led to the clubhouse's reinforced guest suite, a room with steel-lined walls and a direct alarm to the guard shack, Jax and T-Bone moved to the inner sanctum, the tech room. Jax leaned over a glowing monitor, the blue light casting sharp shadows across his tattooed face. T-Bone, Jax said, his voice dropping to a focused whisper. Dig into the Sterling family trust. Not the public filings. The lawyers show the judge. I want the back alley ledgers. Elena told me Mark died in a car crash, a tragic accident on a clear night. Check the police reports from that night, and then check the insurance adjusters. I have a feeling the Sterlings aren't just greedy. I think they're hiding a body. As T-Bone's fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing firewalls that would have stopped a private investigator, the hours of the night ticked away like a countdown. They found the first red flag at 3 a.m., a massive life insurance payout that had been diverted into a Sterling offshore account instead of Sophie's trust. But at 4:30 a.m., they hit the motherlode. T-Bone pulled up a suppressed mechanical report from the night of Mark's accident. The report, which had vanished from the official police record, stated that the brakes on Mark's car hadn't failed due to age or wear. They had been precisely tampered with. Even more chilling was the signature on the scrap disposal authorization for the vehicle the very next morning. It was Richard Sterling, Mark's own father. They didn't just want the money, Jax, T-Bone whispered, his face pale in the blue light. Mark was going to take Sophie and Elena and move across the country. He was going to trigger a full audit of the family's dirty real estate holdings. They killed their own son to keep the empire intact. Now they're after Sophie because she's the last person alive who can legally demand an accounting of those funds. Jax looked at the clock. 6:30 a.m. The sun was beginning to bleed over the horizon, casting a gray, misty light over the industrial district. Print it all, Jax commanded. Every bribe, every signature, every suppressed report. And T-Bone, get the brothers ready. I want the bikes clean and the engines loud. We aren't just going to a hearing. We're going to a funeral for the Sterling reputation. At 8:45 a.m., the downtown courthouse was a scene of clinical, high society order. 3 black limousines sat idling at the curb, and a dozen lawyers in tailored suits stood on the marble steps, clutching leather briefcases like shields. Richard Sterling stood at the center of the group, looking every bit the king preparing to reclaim a lost province. He didn't expect a fight. He expected a broken, exhausted nurse to show up and surrender her daughter in exchange for a few crumbs of the estate. But then, the sound began. It started as a low, ominous vibration in the soles of the lawyers' shoes, a rhythmic thrumming that grew into a deafening, earth-shaking roar. From around the corner, 40 Hells Angels appeared in a perfect, disciplined V formation. They didn't just drive. They occupied the entire street, the morning sun glinting off their chrome like unsheathed swords. At the head of the pack was Jax's shovelhead, and hitched to the side was a custom-fitted sidecar. Inside sat Sophie, wearing a tiny leather vest and a pair of pink goggles, looking more curious than afraid. Elena rode behind Jax, her hands locked firmly around his waist, her face no longer filled with the hollow fear of a victim, but with the cold, hard steel of a woman who had finally found her pack. The bikers pulled up directly in front of the Sterling limousines, the roar of their engines drowning out the city's morning traffic and the protests of the security guards. Jax dismounted with a fluid, powerful motion, reached back to help Elena down, and then lifted Sophie onto his broad shoulder. The lawyers stepped back in a wave of expensive cologne and genuine, visceral terror as the bikers formed 2 lines, creating a corridor of leather and muscle for Jax and Elena to walk through. Richard Sterling stepped forward, his face turning a deep, angry shade of purple. "What is this circus, Elena? You think this display of intimidation will work in a court of law? You've only proven my point. You've brought my granddaughter into a nest of criminals and thugs." Jax stepped forward, his massive frame towering over the old man, his shadow stretching across the courthouse steps. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Actually, Richard, we're here to talk about family values. But you're right about one thing. There's a criminal in this lot. But he isn't wearing a leather vest, and he didn't arrive on a bike." They entered the courtroom, the heavy doors swinging open to a room that was far too small for the presence of the Hells Angels. The judge, an elderly woman known for her legendary no-nonsense attitude and a hatred for corporate bullying, looked up from her bench as 40 bikers filled the back pews, their presence turning the courtroom into a fortress. The Sterling lawyers immediately launched their assault, their voices high-pitched and frantic. "Your Honor," the lead attorney shouted, "this is a mockery. As you can see by the mother's recent associations, she has clearly suffered a mental break. She has entered into a sham marriage with a known outlaw in a desperate, last-ditch effort to circumvent your authority. We ask for the immediate and permanent removal of Sophie Vance from her care for the child's own safety." The judge looked at Jax, then at the marriage certificate on her desk, and finally at Elena. "Mr. Jax," the judge said, her voice dry and piercing, "a marriage of 12 hours is unusual. Do you have something to say before I rule on this emergency motion? Because the law requires stability, not just a signature." Jax stood up, his leather vest creaking in the silent room. He didn't look at the lawyers. He looked at the judge. He reached into his vest and pulled out the thick, red-stamped envelope T-Bone had prepared. "Your Honor, the marriage is as real as the pavement. But we're not here to talk about my wedding. We're here to talk about why Richard Sterling is so desperate to get this child into a boarding school where she can't ask questions." Jax walked to the bench, his boots echoing against the floor. He handed the envelope to the bailiff. "Inside those papers, you'll find the forensic evidence from Mark Sterling's death. You'll find the wire transfers to the mechanic who crushed the car before the police could inspect the brake lines. And you'll find the private ledger showing that Richard Sterling has been embezzling from his own granddaughter's trust for a year. My wife didn't come to me because she was unfit, Your Honor. She came to me because the people who were supposed to protect her were the ones who murdered her husband. She came to me because the Hells Angels are the only people in this county who don't have a price tag. The judge spent 20 grueling minutes reviewing the documents. The silence in the room was so thick it felt like it could shatter. The more she read, the more her face hardened into a mask of judicial fury. She looked up and signaled to the two armed bailiffs at the back of the room. "Bailiffs," she said, her voice sharp as a guillotine. "Detain Mr. Richard Sterling and his lead counsel immediately. I am referring these documents to the state attorney and the FBI for a first-degree murder and racketeering investigation. This hearing is adjourned, but not before I make one thing clear." She looked directly at Elena. "The emergency order is denied. The custody of Sophie remains with her mother. And Mr. Jacks, I expect to see that you keep this child safe while the state cleans up this mess." The back of the courtroom didn't erupt in cheers. That wasn't the club's way. Instead, the bikers stood up as one, a silent, powerful wall of support that made the marble walls of the courthouse seem thin and fragile. As they walked out of the building, the sun was finally breaking through the heavy rain clouds, illuminating the street in a brilliant, golden light. Richard Sterling was led away in handcuffs, his $5,000 suit wrinkled, and his legacy in absolute ruins. He looked at Jax one last time, his eyes filled with a hollow, impotent hatred. Jax didn't even give him the satisfaction of a glance. He walked Sophie to the sidecar, buckled her in with a gentle click, and turned to Elena. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice finally steady, her eyes bright with a future she thought she had lost. Jax climbed onto his shovel head and kicked the engine to life. The roar was a promise of protection that would never expire. "Now we live, Elena. You've got a shift at the clinic, and Sophie's got a life to lead. But from this second on, you don't ride alone. You've got 40 brothers in front of you and 40 behind. And if anyone ever tries to take what's yours again, they'll have to answer to the president." The story of the midnight wedding became a legend that was told in every diner and bar in the county. It wasn't just a story about a biker and a nurse. It was the moment the town realized that justice doesn't always wear a black robe. Sometimes it wears a leather vest and rides a loud machine. Elena remained the town's most beloved nurse, and Sophie grew up as the little sister of the clubhouse, protected by 80 men who would have laid down their lives for her. The Sterlings were erased, their names a footnote in a criminal trial, but the pack remained stronger than ever. What would you do if the system you trusted turned into your greatest enemy? Would you have the courage to walk into the lion's den and ask the outlaws for help? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you believe that family is about who stands by you when the world is burning, hit that subscribe button and join our journey. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you on the open road.